Have you ever had that thing in your reading life where you are encountering similar ideas or threads across multiple books that you're reading and it wasn't necessarily purposeful? That is what I am currently experiencing. If you've been with me chronologically in this vast liminal space of the internet, then you were here when we talked about Taylor Swift's new album, The Tortured Poets Department, through the lens of Aristotle's Poetics. And if you weren't with me when we talked about Taylor Swift's new album, The Tortured Poets Department, through the lens of Aristotle's Poetics, hey, now you know it exists. But in that video, we were discussing something that is tragedy by form with comedic moments, and today we are discussing something that is comedic by form with tragic elements, and that book, as also mentioned in the aforementioned video, is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. Now, we are not going to be discussing this book through the lens of the Poetics because that way lies madness, because this is not necessarily going to follow the Aristotelian model, even of comedy, exactly. To be fair, our discussion earlier this week was also not exact, but where I think that perspective may be of note is that this book doesn't necessarily follow your traditional Aristotelian structure as you as a reader may be going in expecting, and to be fair, I don't know what you are going in as a reader expecting, but the whole thing is a little bit looser, even up to the point of the moment the whole book is kind of hinging around being executed as a kind of reversal in a way that is surprising and satisfying in some ways and just completely off the wall in others. And off the wall is key here, as this is a dark kind of comedy in the way I definitely would expect from an Irish author, and maybe that's just me reading too much Martin McDonagh, though I do not know the films, only the plays. But if you are looking for something that is a little bit McDonagh, a little bit Godot, a little bit the producers, with just a little sprinkling of Christopher Moore, this may be for you. This is a wildly ambitious dark comedy that is very much speaking to our modern moment through the ancient moment. And in that ancient moment, through this book, we are following two protagonists, which gives us that kind of Godot producer setup in that we have our two leads, Gellin and Lampo. We are following Lampo's first-person point of view specifically in this, which is notable in that these two are out-of-work potters. Their pottery factory has closed. They are down on their luck. There are a lot of parallels with deindustrialization and the deferred dreams of the working class in this. And to immediately go back on how I said I was going to approach this text, to go back to Aristotle for just a moment, we know in Aristotle's definition of comedy that we are following the lower classes, or those that aren't necessarily notable figures, and that is really heightened here in the kind of situation of these two, and specifically that we are following the perspective of Lampo, who is very much the sidekick in this dynamic, even as he is attempting to his most valiant efforts to frame himself as some kind of heroic figure. And in that framing, it becomes more comic in a lot of ways, because we see this man who is below average in a lot of ways trying to be bigger, and there is comedy in that, but there is sometimes comedy in that it is so relatable. And these characters aren't necessarily good. They are the opposite of heroic in a lot of ways in that their motivations are incredibly selfish, though there are times where Lampo in particular tries to pretend in the way of a really bad con artist trying to convince you of something, and the entire novel is almost farcical in a way, though again, not necessarily the definition of farce. But we open with Gellin and Lampo kind of in between. There is a lot of air and aimlessness to their existence, which again gives us especially those comparisons, I would argue, to Godot. But they decide what they are going to do with their waste of an afternoon, essentially, is go down and feed the Athenians, because this book is set amidst the Peloponnesian War in Sicily, and so a bunch of Athenian war prisoners are being kept in a quarry. And these two, who by all accounts are below many of these men that are probably being kept prisoner that came as aristocrats or war heroes of whatever renown, and now are starving and burning in this pit at the mercy of these two characters, and they are going down to feed the Athenians, which sounds very altruistic, but we are dealing with very selfish characters. We are in a comedy, so that altruism has another shade to it, and that shade is that Gellin is obsessed with Athenian poetry and drama, particularly Euripides, of Medea renown. And so they go down to the pit to feed the Athenians in exchange for slivers of Euripides, particularly Medea. And in the course of this, they also discover a new last play by Euripides, The Trojan Women. And Gellin gets it in his head that they are going to produce not only Medea, but the Trojan women, using these captured Athenians as actors, which kind of sets off the course of action of the book and the kind of subsequent ridiculousness, because everything obviously goes back to them trying to put these plays up on their feet. But we have two characters who don't know how to produce a play and are discovering in the moment. And there is so much explored in this book, both in relation to art, to refugees and war and prisoners and this kind of xenophobia and othering. And so this is not slapstick humor. I do compare it to Christopher Moore at times in terms of its voice, but also potentially like that crudeness in the humor. But this is dealing with really heavy themes. It's dark, there is a lot of violence here and a lot of shock, and it's using that shock, that dark humor, and that twistedness to kind of shake the reader out of their complacency. It's using this humorous tone and asking us to kind of laugh at these characters at certain points, especially with the point of view we are entering the story from, but then asking us to reconsider that and doing that through these moments that kind of hit us. And again, it doesn't follow the necessarily comedic structure that we may expect from especially like a Greek comedy, which to my recollection of the poetics and my theater history classes usually end in a wedding. We do not have that here, and very much cannot have that here by the nature of the plot setup. But like I said, there's a lot of reversal of expectations here because it's asking us as readers throughout to kind of consider what we think a good ending is here, both for our characters and for the Athenians that are being kept prisoner, and if there is an ending that can satisfy all of them. And it's a really complex exploration amidst this very comedic, kind of lackadaisical kind of exploration in the book. And lackadaisical sounds kind of dismissive, but I mean it more in that the plot, if you are looking for just like a strong Aristotelian plot, like I said, you're gonna come away disappointed, because even within the production of the play, we are building to this dramatic kind of moment and setting up this moment that as readers we have experienced through various forms of media and kind of like the transcendent moment of art. And the transcendence of art is explored very explicitly throughout this whole book. But even the kind of plot around the producing of the play, everything is kind of happening in the tasks on the periphery to get this thing on its feet. We spend a little bit of time in the rehearsals, so to say, but not a whole lot, which means that that isn't necessarily the focus. And when I mentioned that reversal in terms of what we expect from that moment of the production, the opening night of the play itself, I'm hopefully not spoiling exactly what that moment is, but culturally, I think we are set up to expect that moment to be a triumph. It is a moment where everyone will actually see something in our heroes or in this production or this play, these plays, the production of these plays will change minds, change hearts. We have established the power of art and theater throughout this, and so how could it be any different? But spoiler alert, it is different, and even as it's celebrating the power of art, it's also kind of critiquing art at the same time. And as someone who has come up in the theater and been involved in a lot of conversations about theater, I see a lot of that reflected here in terms of what actually makes change. And it's engaging in a lot of these ideas about the nature of art, the purpose of art, and the kind of responsibility of art in the larger landscape through this comedy that is then heightened through especially the kind of selfishness of these characters. It also, unintentionally perhaps, explores the idea of site-specific theater in some ways. It's also very episodic in its nature then, because we don't really have that like ultimate climactic moment as we expected, or we are building toward it and then are kind of reversed in that expectation. But even in the lead up, it always feels kind of like a bumbling. Our characters don't really have, or at least Lampo doesn't really have a strong sense of intention to him. He is very impulsive. We get a whole scene with him kind of getting a bag of coins and kind of coming into this fortune for a specific task and going to the market and blowing all of his money, which of course is very overt cultural criticism in a lot of ways. And all of the sections kind of feel like that to a certain extent. And so we have this dark humor tied together with this idea of producing this play that allows us to explore a lot of cultural critique of the modern moment through the kind of bumbling of our heroes, especially, again, Lampo. Now, one kind of piece that I had to kind of consider a little bit, and I don't know where I ultimately land on it, is in relation to Lampo in particular, and the mention of him within the book as having a clubfoot, and the kind of portrayal and representation of disability in this book, because again, we have this history, especially in comedy, of kind of using disability as a gag, or even sometimes to reveal a moral failing sometimes of a character. I do not agree with that representation, and I really was trying to figure out how I felt about the representation in this book, whether it was playing into that idea, and it's definitely occasionally perceived and used by other characters to undermine or discredit Lampo in some ways, but I don't know if the narrative itself, especially because it's from his point of view, is necessarily poking fun at him because of his disability, but at the same time, because he, again, is a comedic figure. And in the comedy, this is kind of like the quintessential idea of comedy and comic figures. By having that disability, are we inherently poking fun at it? I don't know. I definitely don't think I'd go so far as to say that the representation is necessarily empowering, but I also don't know if it is offensive. So that is just something to be aware of, I think. At the end of the day, there is just a lot of absurdity in this book. It explores the idea of the kind of common man, the everyman, from the most unflattering angle in a lot of ways. I think the scenes that take place in their neighborhood bar are particularly revealing. The idea that we can have a tendency to build the kind of grandeur of ourselves up amidst some more kind of ramshackle circumstances. And it really does explore ideas of class as well a lot. It is very much written for the modern moment and modern considerations through the lens of the ancient, and drawing those parallels and reminding us that in many ways we have not come that far. And by heightening the circumstances and the worst tendencies of our characters, it is forcing us to look in the mirror in many ways. And like I said, it's doing this in a modern voice that meets readers at the current moment. In many ways, it reminds me of Monty Python's Life of Brian, though obviously different stories from different angles, but similar in terms of its episodic nature amidst a more cohesive through line, though Life of Brian definitely has more plot, but contrasting again those more modern considerations and reminding us as readers that maybe we haven't come quite as far as we think we have. And so apologies that I can't lay out more of the book here in terms of the plot, because it all really does trace back to that conceit and the absurdity that springs from that conceit. But if you have read this book, I would be really interested in hearing your thoughts. I wish mine were a little tighter, but here they are nonetheless, and I so appreciate you being interested enough in them to still be with me in this moment. So go ahead and like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah, bye.